By the time the Dalton girls stepped out of the treeline, their dresses stiff with old soil and their eyes clouded with years no one had lived, the town realized something unbearable. These were not the same children they had lost. Before we continue, please subscribe to our channel and tell in the comments where you watching from and what time is it. The morning they were found was cold enough to silver the grass. A thin fog pressed low along the Kentucky Valley, threading between the wooden houses that leaned under their own memories. Harlan had not been expecting an answer, much less a resurrection, yet there they were, two silhouettes emerging from the forest as if the mountain had exhaled them after 11 long years. Margaret Dalton, once 9, now appeared older than her mother. Her hair had grown unevenly, hacked it with something dull. Her younger sister, Ruth, stepped behind her like a shadow that had learned to breathe. Neither spoke at first. They only looked at the waiting world with an expression that frightened even the sheriff, who had thought he had seen all that men or wilderness could do. The fog sharpened the sound of their footsteps as they walked toward the main road, their thin shoes whispering against the gravel. A farmhand named Lowell Carter was the first to see them. He had been carrying a lantern despite the hour, claiming the woods felt wrong lately, as if something in them watched. When his light touched their faces, he dropped the lantern. The flames sputtered, then steadied, revealing the girls fully for the first time. Their eyes were the part people never forgot. Not frightened. Not relieved. Simply resigned, as though they had returned only because something in the forest had finally allowed them to. Lowell shouted, waking the town before sunrise. Doors opened. Mothers pulled children close. Men reached for coats and boots, their breath fogging in the cold. The Dalton sisters stood in the center of the road, unmoving, as if waiting for someone to give them permission to fall apart. Mrs. Dalton arrived running barefoot, her nightdress catching dew, her hair loose and wild with grief sharpened into hope. But when she reached her daughters, both girls stepped back. Margaret flinched at her mother's touch, and Ruth stared at her as if she did not recognize the shape of a mother at all. Whispers spread faster than the fog. 11 years gone. No footprints behind them. No wounds. No explanation. Margaret finally spoke, but the words were wrong. They were not the soft cries of a child found. They were a statement, flat and heavy. We're not supposed to be here. The sheriff tried to gather them, but Ruth resisted. Her hands were cold, almost wooden to the touch. The doctor arrived soon after and guided the girls to his carriage. As he placed a blanket over them, Ruth whispered something only he heard. His face drained. When asked later what she had said, he claimed he could not recall. Those who saw him that day believed he remembered every word. The town gathered outside the doctor's office, crowding the windows, trying to see the impossible children return from the mountain's mouth. Some crossed themselves. Others muttered old mountain beliefs. A few insisted it wasn't the girls at all but two strays molded by grief. Inside, the doctor lit a lantern, its glow trembling along the wooden walls. The girls sat beside each other but did not hold hands. They stared at opposite corners of the room as if studying invisible doorways. He asked them where they had been all these years. Margaret closed her eyes, and when she opened them, the woman she might have become seemed to flicker in and out of her face. Ruth answered instead, though her voice was so thin it nearly vanished beneath the lantern hiss. We were in the house. The one under the hill. The doctor paused, quill still hovering. No one lived under the hill, no structure had ever been there. But Ruth continued, still staring at the corner, her breath shallow, her fingers unmoving on her lap. He kept us there. He said daylight was dangerous. He said we belonged to him now. Margaret's lips parted, but she said nothing. Her silence felt heavier than Ruth's words. The doctor pressed gently. Who kept you? What house? Why come back now? Margaret finally spoke again, her voice like old paper tearing. We didn't come back. He let us go. The lantern dimmed for a moment before settling again. Outside, the crowd shifted, unsure whether they were waiting for a miracle or a confession. When the sheriff entered, both girls jerked their heads toward him in perfect unison. The motion was too precise, too practiced, as though they had lived years responding to a single sound, a single command. The sheriff asked the question that had lived like a thorn in the valley for more than a decade. Are you truly the Dalton girls? Margaret answered with a strange, hollow certainty. We were. Ruth added softly. But we're not now. The doctor ended the questioning, ordering rest. He claimed exhaustion clouded their thoughts. He told the town to stay calm. He insisted the girls needed warmth and quiet, not interrogation. But no one in Harlan slept easily that night. Not the sheriff who swore he had seen something ancient in Margaret's eyes. Not the doctor who locked his door twice. Not the mothers who pulled their children close after hearing Ruth's fragile voice drift softly through the open window as if repeating something learned by repetition, not memory. He said he'd come for us if we told. And out in the woods the fog did not lift for hours. Night settled over Harlan with the weight of an old hymn, slow, mournful, and unwilling to fade. The town breathed in shallow, uneasy rhythms, as though its people feared that even the act of exhaling might draw the girl's unseen captor closer. Far beyond the lamplight, the hills curled like sleeping beasts, their silhouettes merging with the sky. No one dared look at them for long. Inside the doctor's office, the lanterns were dimmed but never extinguished. Margaret and Ruth lay on separate cots, though neither slept. Their eyes remained open, resting not on the room but on something that was no longer there, a place where years had slipped past like water with no memory of sunlight. The doctor kept his vigil at a distance, pretending to read old case notes as his hands trembled. He had attended births, accidents, even the aftermath of mountain feuds, but nothing unnerved him like silence from a child who should have been screaming. Whenever Ruth shifted her gaze, the doctor felt a coldness, as though she were listening to someone standing directly behind him, someone only she had permission to see. The sheriff returned just past midnight. His boots left faint prints of damp soil on the wooden floor. He carried the weight of the town in his jaw, which he clenched until it ached. Harlan had expected closure when the girls were found. Instead, it had been handed a deeper question, one that grew a little darker each time Margaret opened her eyes. He gestured for the doctor to step outside. Their voices murmured beneath the creaking porch boards, blending with the soft rustle of wind that pressed through the pines. No one else heard the conversation, but those who lived nearby reported seeing the sheriff run a hand over his face twice, once in disbelief, once in dread. Inside, Ruth whispered again. She had not spoken for nearly an hour, yet the moment the door closed, her lips formed words barely audible over the lantern hiss. "He doesn't like him here." Margaret, without turning, answered as if they were continuing a conversation that had never truly paused. "He won't come inside. Not while there's fire." Ruth's eyelids fluttered. The glow from the lanterns washed her features in soft amber, but shadows clung beneath her eyes, shadows deeper than sleeplessness. "Do you think he's waiting?" Ruth asked. Margaret did not respond. She only shifted the blanket higher up her shoulders, pulling it to her chin with a strange precision, as if fearful the fabric would displease someone watching from the doorway. The house breathed around them. The wooden walls expanded and contracted with the night air. The wind pressed against the windows in gentle, repeated taps, like fingers searching for weak spots. Every sound in the room gathered shape, forming a presence just outside the girls' cots. The town believed they had been returned. But sometimes, in the stillness between heartbeats, it felt as though something had returned with them. When the sheriff came back inside, Ruth immediately fell silent. Her eyes snapped toward the shadow he cast on the far wall, a tall, wavering shape that seemed too thin to be human. Margaret inhaled sharply, not with fear but with recognition. "We told you he wouldn't come while you're here," she whispered. The sheriff ignored the comment, chalking it up to fatigue or delusion. He approached their cots slowly, hat in hand, as though the room itself required permission to cross. "Girls, I need to ask you one more thing. Who was the man who kept you?" His voice cracked, though he hid it well. Margaret stared at him with a stillness so absolute it felt unnatural. "He wasn't a man." Ruth nodded, echoing the same phrase. "He wasn't a man." The sheriff's brow tightened. In the lamplight, his shadow bent strangely along the wall, fractured by the uneven wood. "Then what was he?" he asked. Ruth opened her mouth, then closed it again. The shape behind her gaze flickered like a lantern on the edge of dying. "We don't know what to call him," Margaret said. "But he had rules. He had ways." Ruth finished the thought. "He said we were better when we listened." The sheriff sat heavily in the chair between them. The lantern beside him dimmed for a fraction of a second, then steadied. He tried to ignore it. He tried to ignore the sense that something else in the room had leaned closer. "Tell me about the house," he said. Ruth flinched, folding her hands tightly. Margaret's voice carried the weight of someone reciting instructions, not memories. It wasn't a house. Not the kind people build. It was a room. A place someone had carved out. He said the mountain had made it for him. He said it knew him. The sheriff swallowed. "And you lived there? For 11 years? We stayed when he said stay. We slept when he said sleep. We woke when he allowed it." The sheriff tried to catch Margaret's gaze, but she kept looking just past him, toward the window, toward the woods, toward something that had shaped a life she no longer fully claimed. The town might never know what compelled him to stand then. Perhaps the weight of Margaret's stare became too much. Perhaps the silence tightened around his throat. He paced once, stepping away from the lantern circle, leaving part of his figure swallowed by shadow. Ruth's breathing quickened. "Don't go there," she whispered. "Don't stand where he is." The sheriff froze. "Where who is?" Margaret pointed, not at the sheriff, not at the window, but at the space just behind the chair he had left. "There. That's his place. He stands there when he wants us quiet." The lantern closest to the chair flickered violently, then steadied again. The sheriff moved back into the light. "We're done for tonight," he said, voice gruff but cracking at the edges. The doctor escorted him out, locking the door behind him. Inside the room, the sisters lay awake long after the footsteps faded. Margaret tilted her head just slightly, listening to something the lantern light could not reveal. Ruth watched her with fearful expectation, waiting for the confirmation they both dreaded. Then Margaret whispered, "He found us again." Morning came reluctantly, as if the sun itself hesitated to touch Harlan after what had returned to it. A pale, colorless light seeped down the mountainsides, dissolving fog in thin ribbons over the town's thinning roofs. But inside the doctor's office, the dawn did nothing to soften the atmosphere. Shadows still clung to corners that lanterns had burned through all night, as though something had layered itself into the wood grain, refusing to leave with the darkness. The doctor had dozed off in his chair, chin slumped to chest, hands folded like a man in prayer who had forgotten what he was praying for. When he awoke, the silence felt different, sharper, as though the room had been listening to something he had missed. Margaret was sitting upright. Ruth was already awake, knees pulled to her chest. Neither girl was looking at him. Both stared at the window. The doctor followed their gaze, finding nothing there but the pale outline of morning mist. Even so, he shut the curtains with a trembling hand. The moment the window darkened, Margaret's shoulders slackened with visible relief. Ruth whispered, "He likes the morning best." The doctor's breath caught. "Oh." But Margaret shook her head, silencing her sister with a quick, almost practiced motion. It was not defiance. It was obedience to something that lingered in the space between certainty and terror. The doctor approached slowly, placing a cup of warm broth on the nightstand between them. The girls didn't look at it. Their attention stayed fixed on the curtain, as if expecting it to move. "You're safe here," he murmured. Ruth blinked once. Margaret still didn't. Safe isn't the same thing as alone. Before he could ask what she meant, the door swung open and Sheriff Coble stepped inside with a stack of reports under his arm and a face carved by sleeplessness. His uniform was wrinkled, his eyes red. He looked not like a man burdened by mystery, but by a truth he desperately hoped to disprove. "Girls," he said, "we're going to talk again, but not here. I've arranged a ride to the county building. Fresh air might help." Ruth stiffened. "No." Margaret's voice cut through the room. "No. You don't take us past the tree line." The sheriff stared at them, confused. "What tree line?" Ruth lifted her arm and pointed not out the window, but downward, toward the base of the mountain behind the town, toward the thick, dark stretch of woods that had swallowed them in 1952 and given them back in 1963. Margaret's voice softened. "The boundary. The place he made." The sheriff set the reports down and crouched beside Margaret's cot. "Listen to me. No one is out there waiting for you. We searched last night. There was nothing." Ruth's eyes filled with an ancient dread, the kind that belonged to someone decades older. "That's because he doesn't wait in ways people understand." The sheriff hesitated. His jaw flexed again. He wanted reason to triumph, wanted logic to stitch the world back together. But reason struggled against the way the girls spoke, the same way survivors of coal mine collapses did. Low, careful, as though loudness might wake something buried. "Tell me," he said quietly, "how did you survive 11 years? Margaret's throat worked painfully. "Then, we didn't. Not in the way you think." Ruth nodded, tears welling but not falling. "Time was different there. He kept the light away. He kept the days from marking themselves." The doctor leaned forward, heart pounding. "Did he hurt you?" Margaret shook her head slowly. "No. That would have been kinder." The sheriff exchanged a troubled glance with the doctor, and something unspoken passed between the two men. A fear neither wanted to name. Sheriff Coble straightened, placing his hat back on his head. "I'll bring the car around," he said. "We're taking them in. Whatever's going on, we need proper statements, not half whispers." Ruth's voice rose, thin and panicked. "Please don't make us leave the house. Please don't take us back toward the woods." Margaret gripped her sister's hand. "He'll think we're coming home." The sheriff left, the door shutting harder than he intended. The doctor moved to offer comfort, but Margaret's next words froze him. "Don't stand there. That's where he stood last night. That's where he listens." The doctor's breath faltered. He stepped back immediately, retreating into lantern light without argument. Before he could challenge the logic of fear, a soft tapping reached the room. Not loud. Not steady. 3 taps. Pause. 2 taps. Long stillness. 1 tap. The doctor spun toward the window. Ruth whimpered. Margaret whispered, "He's counting us." The doctor gathered what remained of his courage and pulled back the curtain. Nothing. Only fog spilling down the glass like silent rain. No shapes, no figures, no shadows except his own trembling outline. But the tapping did not stop. It continued along the wood paneling, moving from the window toward the far corner of the room, slow, deliberate, intelligent. Ruth squeezed her sister's arm. "He found the wall. He knows the room now." Margaret inhaled sharply but did not look away from the sound's progression. "He wants to know if we'll follow." The tapping ceased. For several seconds there was only stillness. Then, a soft exhale. Not from the girls. Not from the doctor. From the darkened corner itself. The doctor staggered backward, nearly knocking over the lantern. It shook, the flame fluttering wildly. The girls pressed together, trembling but expressionless, as if bracing themselves for something familiar. The sheriff re-entered abruptly, breaking the moment. He stopped when he saw the doctor pale as bone, the girls curled against each other, the lantern flickering as though grasped by unseen hands. "What happened?" Neither girl spoke. The doctor swallowed hard. "Sheriff, don't take them outside." "Not yet. Something is—" He never finished the sentence. Because the 3 taps returned. This time from the inside of the wall. Margaret whispered, "He's closer now." The final winter of the Dalton case arrived without ceremony, without an anniversary vigil, without the echo of their names carried through the streets. By 1971, Harlan had developed the habit of forgetting what made it tremble. The mines had opened and closed again. Children had grown into adults with softened versions of the stories their parents once swore were true. The sheriff who handled the case lived out his quiet evenings along the edges of the Cumberland River, speaking to no one about the girls who changed the air of the county. The doctors who examined them retired with files misplaced in basements where humidity curled the edges of every sheet. Yet the truth, or the shadow of it, waited in places untouched by time. The Dalton sisters had been buried side by side a decade earlier, their markers simple, their story left unresolved. But the forest that had returned them did not share the town's desire for silence. It preserved memory the way moss preserved stones, slow and steady, neither kind nor cruel. A rumor began to circulate among hunters who trekked toward the northern ridge. They spoke of a cabin leaning into the earth, half collapsed, half swallowed by roots, its door missing as though ripped away. They said the inside smelled of lye and old paper. They said the floor was littered with tin cups, cracked plates, and a chair with rope marks worn into its arms. The county dismissed the talk as backwoods tales, but the details kept repeating. And always, someone swore they saw a name carved into the frame of the single remaining window. Thomas. No surname, no date, no reason. Just a name. That winter, a final investigation was arranged, not by the authorities but by a team of archivists who had come to document the forgotten crimes of the region. They were drawn to the Dalton case because it resisted closure. Every detail that should have led to resolution had instead dissolved into contradictions. The girls' memories were dismissed. The authorities' timelines were incomplete. The forest geography did not match any known map from the era. Yet, in spite of inconsistencies, the archivists believed there was a shape beneath the story, an outline waiting to be uncovered. They set out before dawn, carrying lanterns though they knew flashlights would have sufficed. Perhaps they wanted the past to feel tangible, or perhaps the cold morning demanded a softer light. The woods welcomed them with the same uneasy quiet described by the sisters years earlier. The river moved gently beneath a thin veil of ice. The path narrowed into a corridor of bare trees that rattled faintly when wind pressed through them. The air tasted metallic as though the season had turned heavy with unspoken things. By noon they reached the supposed location of the cabin. It existed though barely. The roof sagged inward, its beams softened by rot. The doorway was nothing more than a dark mouth, open and breathless. The archivists stepped inside one by one, careful not to disturb anything, yet fully aware that disturbance was inevitable. They found the remains of a fire pit, extinguished decades earlier. They found empty jars arranged in a row along a shelf, their labels faded to white scars. They found a bed frame fashioned from lumber likely carried up from the valley. And on the wall, near the narrow window where winter light streamed in, a series of deep, deliberate scratches. Not frantic. Not random. Patterned. Lines forming rows. Rows forming groups. Groups following no clear language, yet carrying an intention that could be felt more than read. One archivist leaned closer, squinting. She noticed that the scratches formed sets of 11. 11 lines, then a space. 11 more. Again and again. Her breath caught slightly. That number belonged to the Dalton girls. 11 years gone. 11 winters missed. 11 summers unaccounted for. Another archivist stepped outside to survey the perimeter. The ground was uneven, softened by thawing frost. Near the back wall he discovered a buried chain ring, the kind used for tethering livestock or large equipment. Only it was not positioned as one might expect. It was anchored into the ground, not a fence post. And the soil around it bore the faint round shape of something that had once stood there. A pole? A stake? Something that required anchoring. The archivist said nothing for a long time. Instead they listened, to the wind, to the bare branches, to the relentless quiet that carried none of the warmth of late afternoon. What they found in that place was not proof of the girl's story, but it was not disproof either. It sat trembling between certainty and doubt. The cabin was too real to ignore, yet too empty to condemn. Whatever had happened there had been carved out of the world with deliberate removal. A person had lived there long enough to develop routines. Someone had left in a hurry or been forced to vanish. Evidence had been erased, but the erasure itself had become a form of evidence. The archivists documented every detail, though they knew that modern authorities would likely regard the site as irrelevant. An unrelated structure, a coincidence of symbols, an abandoned dwelling mistaken for something larger. And perhaps it was. Or perhaps the truth hides best when it resembles ordinary decay. As they prepared to leave, the youngest of the archivists lingered at the window where the name had been carved. Thomas. Her lantern illuminated the grooves, revealing that they were far older than any other marking in the cabin. The wood around the letters had darkened with decades of drafts and rain, sealing the name in a way paint never could. She wondered whether the Dalton girls had ever spoken the truth freely, without fear of being corrected or dismissed. She wondered whether they had carried their memories with certainty or with doubt. Trauma has a way of smudging its own lines, yet their voices, recorded only once in that small room of the county courthouse, contained a steadiness impossible to ignore. The archivists left at dusk. The woods dimmed until the horizon became a violet reminder of distance. The cabin sank back into the quiet as though relieved to be alone again. But something had changed. A story that had been sealed for decades had been touched, stirred, woken. The Dalton girls' confession remained unproven, yet its edges glowed faintly now, outlined by the discovery. History does not always offer closure, but it occasionally offers acknowledgement. And acknowledgement in forgotten stories is sometimes enough. Their truth lived on, not in court records or headline clippings, but in the softened wood of a cabin no one had believed existed. If the past whispered to you tonight, honor it with a like, and let your subscribe keep the echoes alive.